right. So I guess it was a few days ago now. The website Stronger by Science, an article went up by our very own Greg Nuckols. The article was called "The Evidence is Lacking for Effective Reps." And as we've done on the show previously, one of the cool things about the podcast is that after we publish an article on the site, we have an opportunity to see what the feedback is like. And the podcast gives us a great opportunity to clarify things, discuss kind of how people receive the article, any questions that came up from readers. So we do want to take some time to talk about this article. So before we get into that, Greg, can you explain what the general concept of effective reps is?
Yeah, so the nugget of the idea behind effective reps is basically for a rep of an exercise to promote hypertrophy, it needs to be close enough to failure that it's kind of hard. And the reason for that is basically a lot of the mechanistic work looking at what kicks off muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy shows that it shows that one, your highest threshold motor units are probably the ones that are the most susceptible to hypertrophy. And so they're not going to be recruited unless a load is adequately heavy or until you're close enough to failure. So an implication of Henneman's size principle, which is just like a very foundational aspect of muscle physiology, is that as loads increase, more and more motor units are recruited. And then also with lighter loads, if you take them to failure, for the first few reps, most of just like lower threshold motor units will be recruited. And then as they start fatiguing and you get closer and closer to failure, more and more of your high threshold motor units will eventually be recruited. So, either doing reps with heavy weight or doing lighter weight all the way to failure, both of those things will eventually recruit all of your motor units. So the idea being that until you get pretty close to failure, you probably haven't really tapped into those highest threshold motor units. And then the other thing is most of the at least best characterized physiological pathways that initiate muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy are related to muscular tension in some way, shape, or form. So essentially, there's little things, there's spots where the muscle fiber is attached to the connective tissue matrix that surrounds each muscle fiber and also runs through the muscle. And it seems like a lot of the actual molecular pathways that eventually trigger muscle protein synthesis have a lot to do with those little adhesion points. And when tension is put on the fiber and it kind of pulls on those adhesion points, that activates various kinases that then trigger the processes that eventually lead to muscle protein synthesis. So those are tension-based processes. So the idea is you need to both recruit motor units and then also expose those fibers to enough tension that it's going to kick off all of the hypertrophy cascade. And the notion here is that with weights that aren't super heavy, so weights that aren't 5 rep max or below, you're probably not recruiting all of your motor units from the first rep, and you can probably move each rep pretty quickly. And when you're moving a rep pretty quickly, you don't have enough time to form enough actin-myosin cross bridges within each fiber for there to be a ton of tension on the fiber. So basically, if you're grinding a 1 rep max, or if you're doing something plyometric, you're probably recruiting all or most of your motor units for both of those two things. But there's way more tension when you're doing the 1 rep max because the plyometric is very explosive. The shortening velocity is high. There's just not that much time for too many cross bridges to form to create tension, which is why, if you grind out several sets of 10 to failure, you grow quite a bit. You do some jumps, you don't grow all that much. So that's kind of the idea, the kernel of the idea behind effective reps. You need to recruit those high threshold motor units, and you need to get movement velocity low enough that each fiber can be exposed to a whole lot of tension. The idea some people have is to maximize tension on each fiber, which they propose will occur right before failure.
And this idea has gotten a lot of traction, right? Like you did a little poll on your Instagram the other day, basically saying like, essentially the question was like, how favorably do you view this effective reps idea? Was that essentially what you asked?
Yeah. So the original poll, I think, had two options. One was it's legit, and the other is it's bogus. And then like a bunch of people messaged me. It's like, oh, it's probably more complicated than that. It's like, dude, you can only give two fucking options for an Instagram poll. Like, calm down. So then I added another like slide to my Instagram story that says like, you can also interpret this as like mostly correct or like mostly incorrect. And I added that within like 30 minutes of the poll going up. But anyway, so like 2,500 people voted in that. And it was like 62% in favor of effective reps being a valid model and 38% against. And so there's various, like quite a few people have put forward various ideas for effective reps. Chris Beardsley's model is probably the most well known. So that's what my article was critiquing. But James Krieger has put forth a similar idea, Carl Junot, and I'm going to butcher his name, but I think you pronounce it Borge. But everyone calls him Borge because I think no one knows how to pronounce his name.
We're not the people to ask about it.
Anyway, so they've all put forth various effective reps-esque concepts, but Chris Beardsley's idea is the one that has gotten the most traction. And it is essentially the idea that the last 5 reps before failure are the ones that are effective. Those are the ones where basically all of the motor units have been recruited and there's going to be enough tension per fiber to trigger hypertrophy. And he has spelled it out in such a way that at least makes it seem that each one of those 5 would be similarly effective. So he's like gone through like different scenarios, like, oh, if you do, 4 sets to failure, or 4 sets 1 rep shy of failure, 4 sets 2 reps shy of failure, like this is how many effective reps you would get. And that very much makes it seem like it's not like, oh, maybe the rep before failure is the one that's actually the most effective, and like the one 5 reps out is a little effective but not as close. Like it's a pretty straightforward model where basically if it's within 5 reps of failure, it counts. If it's more than 5 reps out, it doesn't count. So like an implication of that is if you did 4 reps, or if you did 4 sets to failure, that would get you 4 more effective reps than 4 sets 1 rep shy of failure. You'd get 20 effective reps. So the last 5 of each set, if you did 4 sets to failure, you'd only get 16 effective reps, or the last 4 of each set if you did 4 sets 1 rep shy of failure. So another implication there is if you kind of do traditional strength training where, you're probably terminating most sets 2 to 3 reps shy of failure, then you would probably need to do 8 sets to get the same hypertrophic effect as 4 sets to failure. So just kind of throwing some concrete implications of the model out there. And so the thing about this concept of effective reps is it has some degree of mechanistic support. So for example, if you look at research where like people are doing isometric exercise at different percentages of maximum voluntary isometric contraction, it seems like working up to about 80-85% of MVIC, that's like the range in which motor unit recruitment does increase. And past about 80% or so, most of the further increase in force just has to do with increases in motor unit firing rates. And there's also some research looking at surface EMG for single joint exercises, finding that when you get about 5-ish reps from failure, for single joint exercises, EMG plateaus, and you don't get further increases in EMG as you get closer to failure. So EMG isn't it's not like one-to-one the same thing as motor unit recruitment, but the two things do correlate reasonably well. And there's also like direct evidence showing that you do need pretty slow contraction speeds to maximize per fiber tension, essentially because the rate at which actin-myosin detachment can occur is like pretty variable, but the rate at which detachment can occur is pretty variable, but the rate that attachment can occur is fixed and reasonably low. And so with really high fiber shortening velocities, you get like fiber detachment rates can exceed attachment rates. So only like a fairly small percentage of your like actin and myosin cross bridges potential are actually forming. But with slower contraction velocities, the attachment and detachment rates can match up better. And so you can get much higher per fiber tension. So anyway, that's the mechanistic idea. There is mechanistic evidence underlying that. And there is also some degree of experimental evidence to back this up. So the two studies that I think most people would cite as evidence for the concept of effective reps is one back from like 2004, 2005 by Goto et al., and then a more recent one by Martorelli and colleagues. And so in the Goto study, basically you had two groups doing 4 sets of 10. One of the group was taking those sets to failure, and the other group was taking like a 30-second break between reps 5 and 6 of each set. And so with that 30-second intra-set break, they weren't taking each set to failure because they were getting a little bit of rest in between. And in that study, they were doing knee extensions and they were measuring quad growth. And they found that the group doing those 10 reps straight through without the break in the middle did grow considerably more. It was like 2.5 times more. And then in the more recent Martorelli study, untrained women were doing bicep curls at 70% of their max. One group was doing 3 sets to failure. One group was doing 3 sets of 7, which would probably be 5 or 6-ish reps from failure. And one group was doing 4 sets of 7, which was like trying to match volume load with the 3 sets to failure group.
Do you think 7 is the least common number of reps to prescribe?
I think,
like in the history
so.
of lifting? I've never heard of someone being like, give me a good 7 here.
I don't see many 4s either.
Oh, I do 4s all the time.
I don't think that many people do 4s.
Don't talk to my clients.
I see a lot of heavy triples, and then of course 5.
Yeah.
But yeah, don't see too many 4s.
I do 4s all the time, but 7s are off the table. I would never dare prescribe a 7.
Sure. But anyway, so in the Martorelli study, the increase in biceps thickness, I think, was like 18.5% in the failure group, like 8.5% in the 4 sets of 7 group, and like 2% in the 3 sets of 7 group. So pretty big difference there. So that's kind of like the evidence in favor of this effective reps model. But there are problems with it. So the research suggesting increased motor unit recruitment up to about 80-85% of 1 rep max, or about 5 reps shy of failure. Most of that is looking at single joint exercises. And you can also find it some with like multi-joint exercises with untrained lifters. But there's actually several studies using trained lifters doing multi-joint exercises, finding that the prime movers might be pretty close to full motor unit recruitment at considerably lower loads further from failure. So there was a recent study by Van den Tillar and colleagues looking at the squat, and it was looking at quadricep. So I think every head of the quads except for the vastus intermedius. It was looking at quadricep, hamstring, and glute EMG with increasing loads, and found that with loads between like 50% and 90% of 1 rep max, for like the first rep of each set, quad EMG was the same. So there's actually modeling research by Bryanton and colleagues using a measure called relative muscular effort, which is essentially the external moments presented by an exercise divided by the joint moments kind of measured in a single joint way that lifters can produce like in isolation. And so that study found that relative muscular effort in the squat basically didn't change with increased loads. And so that does actually seem to match with EMG as well. And so also in that study, it looked again at hamstring and glute EMG, and it did see that those were going up with increased load. And so the quads are probably, if you had to choose one prime mover in the squat, it is probably the quads. And so the prime mover, pretty high EMG from the get-go. Some of the like secondary supporting muscles, increased EMG as load goes up. Similar with an older study by McBride and colleagues, it looked at quad and hamstring EMG with 70, 80, and 90% loads. It found that quad EMG at 70%, pretty much the same as 90%, but hamstring EMG, again, was much higher at 90% than 70%. So again, prime mover EMG, pretty high, even at fairly low loads, like 70%'s reasonably low. But a secondary muscle, in that case, the hamstrings, ramping up as load increases. And then there was also a study from a couple years back by Kroll and Golis looking at increasing loads in the bench press. And it found that PEC EMG also basically the same between 70% 1 rep max loads and actual 1 rep max loads. But the EMG of the front delts, triceps, and maybe lats also did go up with increasing loads. So again, if you had to pick a prime mover in the bench press, it's probably going to be the pecs. Don't tell Louis I said that. But the secondary muscles, your triceps, front delts, those EMG is going up as loads increase. So it very well could be that kind of first assumption of the effective reps model that you do need full recruitment and you need to go pretty close to failure or pretty heavy loads to get that full recruitment. I think that is very much true with single joint exercises, but I'm not confident that that is actually true with trained lifters doing multi-joint exercises, especially if you're interested in the prime movers. So for example, if you're interested in squatting for hamstring growth, one, that's kind of dumb, like we've written about that on the site before. But two, if you were doing that, maybe it would behoove you to go to failure on every set. But if you're squatting for quad growth, you may not have to actually go that close to failure to stimulate your quads pretty well. And then the second assumption there, like needing pretty slow contractile velocities to achieve full tension on each fiber, I'm pretty skeptical of that. And the reason I'm skeptical of it is, so that's largely based on the load velocity relationship or the force velocity curve, where at higher forces, velocity is lower, at lower velocities, or at lower forces, velocity is higher. But that again is established under unfatigued conditions. So essentially, if you're having a fiber contract against increasing loads, as the loads go up, contraction velocity decreases. But under conditions of fatigue, it's not the exact same relationship. Under conditions of fatigue, if velocity is fatigue with the same load, just to be clear, as velocity is going down, force is also going down. Like force and tension aren't increasing as velocity decreases, as you do, say, like a set of 12 to failure. Like velocity is going to be lowest on the last rep before failure, but I don't think you can make the case that per fiber tension is higher. At that point, your fibers have fatigued. There's going to be some metabolites in there that affect the interactions between actin and myosin, and also like central drive is going to decrease. So the frequency with which or the frequency at which motor units or the motor nerves can reach depolarization and send signals to the fibers, like firing rates, that's going to be lower as well. So I don't think the lower velocities closer to failure during a set to failure with a fixed load indicates higher tension per fiber. I think it indicates that you can't produce as much tension per fiber. So if you're using high per fiber tension as a reason supporting the effective reps model, I don't think that you can make that argument in the context of a set to failure. So lower velocity is lower tension in that case, not the same as like the force velocity relationship with changing loads when you're fresh. So anyway, the biggest thing I'm trying to get at here is that the mechanistic underpinnings of the effective reps model, they make sense insofar as recruiting those highest threshold motor units and exposing them to a fair amount of tension. Those things make sense based on what we mechanistically know about hypertrophy. But the idea that you necessarily need to be within 5 reps of failure to trigger those things, I'm less sold on. I think you can get pretty close to full motor unit recruitment for the prime movers of multi-joint exercises quite a bit further out from failure. And I don't actually think you're maximizing per fiber tension as you get closer to failure. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get more growth closer to failure, but I think the idea that is what's maximizing per fiber tension and that is then what is promoting hypertrophy, I think the evidence in favor of that comes from studies on the wrong context, which is looking at unfatigued fibers with different loads versus under the influence of fatigue taking the same load to failure.